John Stevens, a middle-aged man, lived a comfortable life in New York City, heir to a vast fortune that his family had built over generations. He was respected in the business world, managing several lucrative ventures, and his inner circle was small but solid. His wife, Elizabeth, was a constant presence at his side, always elegant and attentive. Along with her, his longtime friend, Mark, was his confidant and partner in many of the important decisions in his life. That evening, the Stevens mansion was lit up for a grand event. The main hall was filled with prominent figures, businessmen, politicians, and influencers from New York's high society. The atmosphere was celebratory, with animated conversations and champagne toasts ringing throughout the hall. However, John felt uneasy. During the event, he had to step away for a moment, heading to his office on the upper floor. Upon entering, a folder on the desk caught his attention. He knew he hadn't left it there. Intrigued, he opened it and began leafing through the papers. His hands trembled as he encountered the contents. They were financial documents filled with details he didn't recognize. Transactions from his businesses were listed, but the origin and destination of the funds seemed strange. What disturbed him the most was the signature at the bottom of one of the documents. Mark. His stomach turned, and his mind was flooded with disjointed thoughts. He knew something was wrong, but before he could process what he had found, he heard Elizabeth's footsteps in the hallway. Quickly, he closed the folder and put the papers away in the drawer. When he returned to the party, his smile was more forced than usual. The unease consumed him, but he knew it wasn't the right moment to confront anyone. First, he needed to better understand what was happening. In the days following the party, John couldn't shake the thought of those documents. Each detail seemed like a piece of a dark puzzle. He began to investigate the papers more carefully, and what he discovered was devastating. There had been million-dollar transfers from one of his companies to bank accounts he didn't recognize. Mark's name appeared repeatedly in the transactions, but it wasn't just that. Some emails exchanged between Elizabeth and Mark suggested a level of closeness that John had never suspected. The betrayal wasn't just financial. His wife and his best friend were involved in a way he could never have imagined. The shock of the revelation hit him like a punch in the chest. However, instead of confronting them immediately, John made an unexpected decision. He knew that if he acted rashly, he could lose everything. He needed time, he needed to plan. The thought of revenge began to form in his mind. As he continued his investigations, he discovered that Elizabeth and Mark had been siphoning money from his businesses for over a year, with the goal of leaving him ruined. More than that, they were building a network of support among other corrupt businessmen to ensure that when he fell, no one would come to his aid. The pain John felt was almost unbearable, but at the same time, his determination only grew. He wasn't a man who gave up easily. He wouldn't let his life be destroyed by those he trusted the most. So, he decided to keep up the facade of a loving husband and loyal friend, while silently plotting a revenge that would make them regret every act of betrayal. While pretending normalcy in his relationships with Elizabeth and Mark, John began diverting some of his money into a secret account as a protective measure. He knew he couldn't trust anyone else. And so, in silence, the first piece of his plan was about to be set in motion. John spent the following weeks maintaining the facade of a perfect life. He and Elizabeth continued attending high society events, and Mark, always smiling, remained by his side as if nothing had changed. But inside, John's tension grew with each passing day. He knew he had to keep playing the game. The first part of his plan was to ensure that Elizabeth and Mark believed everything was under control. He wanted them to feel secure, to think that John had no idea what was happening. To that end, he maintained appearances, especially at work. He continued treating Mark with the same trust as always, allowing him to participate in business decisions and ventures. However, while pretending everything was normal, John started digging deeper. He discreetly hired a team of investigators to track Mark and Elizabeth's activities. What he uncovered was even more revealing. Mark was transferring funds to a series of shell companies, some located in offshore tax havens. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had secret accounts in foreign banks. John also began testing the loyalty of other executives in his companies. He knew he couldn't trust everyone, and slowly, he identified those who seemed to be involved with Mark and Elizabeth. He asked indirect questions, observed reactions, and when necessary, cross-referenced information with what his investigators found. With every step, he gathered more pieces of the puzzle. Gradually, John was mapping out his plan. He knew that for his revenge to be effective, it required patience and precision. Every move had to be carefully calculated, like in a game of chess. And for the moment, he maintained his position, allowing Elizabeth and Mark to believe they had control. The first concrete step in John's plan took place during a strategic business meeting. He knew that Mark was attempting to take control of one of his most profitable companies, a chain of luxury hotels in Miami. Unbeknownst to Mark, John had already transferred part of the company's assets into a secure account, but he let Mark continue thinking his plans were proceeding unhindered. In the meeting, John allowed Mark to lead much of the discussion, as he often did. Mark exuded confidence, charming the other directors and steering them in his favor. Mark's goal was to approve a merger that, in theory, would bring great benefits to the company but would, in practice, funnel funds into his personal schemes. Fully aware of this, John let the conversation progress, allowing Mark to believe he was on the brink of success. However, when the crucial moment arrived, John made his move. He subtly presented a series of data that contradicted Mark's plan, exposing its flaws and the risks of the merger. The other directors, surprised, began to question Mark, who became visibly unsettled. Then, John suggested a deeper investigation before making any decisions, which everyone agreed to. Mark remained silent, unable to react to the public humiliation that was beginning to unfold. The meeting ended with a promise to reassess the merger, but Mark knew he was in trouble. He had lost the first battle, and John had achieved it without anyone realizing his true intent. Back in his office, John allowed himself a small smile. It was just the beginning. He knew he would need to be even more cautious moving forward, as Mark and Elizabeth would surely start sensing something was wrong. Nevertheless, he had made his first move and was confident that his plan was working. From that moment on, things began to get more complicated. Despite the humiliating defeat at the meeting, Mark wasn't one to give up so easily. In the days that followed, John noticed subtle changes in his behavior. Mark began avoiding him in casual conversations and became more reserved in business discussions. Additionally, Elizabeth seemed more distant, as if something in their marital relationship was slowly crumbling. John knew that both of them were beginning to suspect something was wrong, but they still believed he had no idea about their plot. However, tensions escalated when Mark, in a desperate move, attempted once again to take control of one of the company's assets. This time, John was prepared. Mark orchestrated a maneuver to assume control of an international logistics subsidiary, using frontmen to hide his own involvement. He thought he could carry out the operation undetected, but John had already anticipated the move and was one step ahead. The network of spies he had set up with the investigators was starting to bear fruit. In a closed-door meeting with the international directors, John once again revealed the flaws in Mark's plan, this time with even more damning evidence. Documents were presented that demonstrated the connection between Mark and the shell companies. The blow was devastating for Mark, who, unable to refute the evidence, was forced to back down. After the meeting, Mark's gaze toward John was filled with resentment. He knew he had lost another battle, but he also knew something bigger was at stake. The smiles that Mark and Elizabeth used to exchange at dinners and social events had disappeared. Now, they were colder, almost like silent conspirators. John realized the game was becoming more dangerous. At any moment, Elizabeth and Mark could try to confront him directly, and he needed to be prepared for the inevitable showdown. Still, he felt in control of the situation. He knew their confidence was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Realizing that he was increasingly alone in his crusade to destroy the traitors, John decided he needed an ally. He knew that Mark and Elizabeth were not acting alone. There was a network of powerful people behind them, manipulating the game. To defeat them, he would need help. That's when he remembered an old business associate, Michael Kent, an investor who, years ago, had been wronged by Mark in a deal. John knew that Michael harbored a deep grudge against Mark, but had never had the chance to seek revenge. He was the perfect ally. Discreetly, John reached out to him, inviting him to a meeting far from the spotlight of high society. They met at a small coastal villa, far from the hustle and bustle of New York, to discuss what John had discovered. Initially skeptical, Michael listened attentively as John detailed the betrayal of Elizabeth and Mark. With every word, Michael's fury grew. By the time John finished explaining, Michael agreed to help him. He had connections and influence in international markets, and with the right information, he could dismantle the support networks Mark had built. The two men devised a detailed plan to financially attack Mark and Elizabeth, starting with the international businesses they had established. Michael would use his contacts to sabotage Mark's foreign deals, while John would continue to act from the shadows, manipulating the domestic operations. With this alliance, John felt he was getting closer to his goal. However, he knew that each move had to be executed with extreme caution. Mark and Elizabeth were more vigilant than ever, and any misstep could put the entire plan at risk. But with Michael by his side, John was ready to deliver the most decisive blow of all. The days following the alliance with Michael were filled with intense activity. John and Michael began quietly dismantling Mark's businesses abroad. In no time, some of Mark's most valuable contracts were mysteriously canceled, and companies that had once been allies began distancing themselves from him. Mark was starting to feel the pressure, and John could sense his unease in every encounter they had. In the midst of this growing tension, John made a disturbing discovery. As he dug deeper into the financial transactions between Elizabeth and Mark, he uncovered links to a group of international investors. These investors weren't just accomplices. They were directly involved in the plot to destroy his fortune and his reputation. The scheme was far bigger than John had initially imagined. Elizabeth and Mark weren't just siphoning money. They were planning to completely ruin his public image by associating his name with international financial fraud. The revelation hit him like a punch in the gut. The betrayal of Elizabeth and Mark wasn't just personal. It was part of a conspiracy involving powerful figures willing to do anything to destroy his standing in the business world. John felt the gravity of the situation increase exponentially. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, he could lose everything. Not just his money, but also the reputation he had worked so hard to build. This revelation forced John to accelerate his plan for revenge. He could no longer afford to wait. Time was running out, and the enemy was far stronger than he had anticipated. Yet, John didn't show any signs of concern when facing Elizabeth and Mark. He continued to act with the same calm, knowing that any misstep could be fatal. The decisive blow was planned for a corporate meeting that John knew would be the perfect opportunity to expose the entire truth. The event would bring together the key shareholders and directors of his companies, including Mark and Elizabeth, who believed they were advancing their plans without interference. What they didn't know was that John had already set the stage for their downfall. On the morning of the meeting, Mark and Elizabeth entered the room with their usual confidence, ignoring John's distant gaze as he watched them from afar. The main topic of the meeting was the approval of new expansion projects, a plan that, in reality, involved more embezzlement for Mark's schemes. However, when John took the floor, the course of the meeting changed drastically. With meticulous calm, he began revealing details about Mark and Elizabeth's illegal transactions, presenting undeniable evidence one after another. Documents, emails, and even recordings of compromising conversations were shown to everyone in attendance. Mark's expression quickly shifted from confidence to desperation, while Elizabeth, in shock, struggled to conceal the severity of the situation. The directors and shareholders, astonished, began asking questions, demanding explanations from Mark and Elizabeth, who had no way to defend themselves. The room, once filled with praise and promises of success, transformed into a scene of accusations and distrust. The international investors who had once backed the couple realized their own positions were at risk and quickly distanced themselves, leaving Mark and Elizabeth to face the consequences alone. The public revelation of their betrayal was devastating. They instantly lost the support they had built, and the humiliation was complete when John announced that he was filing a lawsuit against them for fraud and conspiracy. Mark, silent, knew his career was over. Elizabeth, trying to maintain her composure, left the room before the situation could worsen. With the final blow delivered, John knew he had won. The traitors were exposed, and his empire was safe. However, he also knew that more was at stake than just a corporate victory. Mark and Elizabeth's downfall was swift and merciless. The public humiliation they suffered at the corporate meeting was only the beginning of their ruin. As soon as the evidence presented by John was reviewed by the authorities, a formal investigation was launched. The news spread quickly, and their reputations were destroyed within days. Mark was the first to fall. His businesses collapsed almost instantly. Shareholders withdrew their support, contracts were canceled, and Mark's name, once synonymous with success, became synonymous with fraud. His assets were frozen, and he was forced to abandon any hope of recovering what he had lost. In the business world, he became a pariah. Elizabeth, on the other hand, faced an even more delicate situation. In addition to losing the prestige and social connections she valued so much, her public image was shattered. The media portrayed her as an accomplice to a fraudulent scheme, a woman who had betrayed her own husband to steal his fortune. Friends and acquaintances avoided her, and even those who had once benefited from her proximity could no longer be seen with her. She found herself alone, isolated, and without resources. John watched the destruction of both with a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. He had achieved what he wanted. He had exposed the betrayal, destroyed his enemies, and preserved his empire. But as the consequences of Mark and Elizabeth's downfall unfolded, John began to realize that victory had come at a price. Although his fortune was intact and his name had been cleared, something inside John had changed. The betrayal, the revenge, the manipulation, it had all transformed him. He was no longer the same man who had embarked on this journey, and with every new defeat that his enemies faced, he felt a growing weight in his chest. After the confrontation, John found himself alone in his vast mansion in New York, reflecting on everything that had happened. The silence of the grand halls, once filled with parties and laughter, now echoed in a disconcerting way. Elizabeth was gone from his life, and though he had dismantled her plans, the space she once occupied felt emptier than he had anticipated. The last few weeks had been a series of calculated victories, but now, with everything over, John wondered if revenge had truly brought him the relief he had expected. Mark, a lifelong friend despite everything, was no longer in his life. The betrayal had made him more cautious, harder, and in some ways lonelier. He reflected on the nature of trust and loyalty. Why hadn't he seen it coming? How could those he loved and trusted most have plotted something so cruel? And more importantly, what did that say about him? In the end, John realized that while he had won the battle, something inside him had been lost forever. Still, he knew that life would go on. There would be new challenges ahead, new allies to find, and undoubtedly new enemies lurking. The world of business never stopped, and neither could he. But now, with a sharper understanding of the true value of relationships, he promised himself never to let the desire for revenge consume him again. As he looked out over the New York skyline one last time, John prepared to start anew. He knew new opportunities would arise, and though the scars of betrayal would always be there, he was ready to move forward, stronger, more cautious, and perhaps a little wiser.